How you doing, everybody? Remember to stretch, right? Just healthy habits. Anyways, we're going to be talking about the OTA patch today. A lot of changes here. They kind of have to talk about their last patch and some of the issues there, but should be an interesting one. Remember, you can skip to like half 20 minutes if you want to skip the introduction. Anyways, let's get started. All right, we've got a big one today, and this one is definitely different from, I guess, Second Dinner's usual OTAs. They usually just get right into it, but here they want to kind of explain some of their decision making. I do think it's something we do want to talk about ourselves as well. So let's get into it. So first, they have the balancing act, right? We've received a lot of questions about their unusually high number of balance reservations to new cards over the last couple of months. I definitely think this is something they're trying out and seeing how it feels. It's not our intention to change new cards as often. However, a variety of related issues combine to impact multiple cards. So I just don't think I think they assume a lot of the cards they release are balanced, right? Which, obviously is not necessarily true, right? But there is like this issue where it has to be playable, or it has to be good enough that people want to buy it, but also not broken. And that's a fine line, right? Because players, we tend to like winning easily, right? Like that is our prerogative. The easiest way to win against other people of our skill level, give me that, right? So Secretary wants to kind of incorporate that, wants to include new strategies that feel easier to win, but not overpowered, right? And fortunately for them, they have metrics to kind of look at that and see if those things do happen. So they do internal testing and whatnot, but then when it comes to live servers, that's when you really see, how easy it is to win. And something you have to keep in mind is that probably the developers are not, stupid or bad or anything like that. Like they're not going to fall for some tricks that you might fall for at lower levels of play. Like that is something it's hard to kind of incorporate into your balance cycle, where it's like, how susceptible are you to losing to this if you're not paying attention, right? When you're balancing or playtesting, right, a lot of your playtesters are good, or at least developers and stuff like they have good mindsets about the game. But when it comes to live testing, a lot of times what you're not really incorporating is like how many people are just going to lose to this, before infinite rank, like at rank 30, rank 40, like how easy it is to just like, hey, if I do this, I always win, right? So those kind of things don't really happen in previous testing, and really only shows up in the live servers. And when it's like, oh, there's an outlier, this combo is so hard for people, at under rank 80 to deal with, right? We have to adjust, right? So those are some of the challenges that might not be notable until you hit the live servers and stuff like that. They also have some other issues, right? They go into it here. Unusual and unexpected development cycles. So their development cycle is pretty short. What they do, it seems, is they kind of work on multiple seasons at once, or multiple seasons, and then, or a season and they move on, and a season and they move on, right? So that they're kind of months ahead in terms of the development cycle. Because usually if you're not months ahead, you'll have issues where like things won't be ready on time, right? Because there's always issues that come up. They have multiple complex cards. Yeah, earlier on, right, like earlier in the development cycle, it was kind of okay to just have a simple card, right? Like, hey, this card is a 4/6 or whatever, right? Oh, and then it gains 2 power if you do something. All right, so that was like okay, but a lot of those simple cards have already been made, and you can't make them again. So you have to do something unique now, right? Like where it's like, oh, I have a 4/10. It's like, well, we have 3 4/10s, right? Like you can't really do that. So new cards require more thinking, as they require more abilities to stand out. So that also requires more time. And then play testing concurrent seasons isolation for too long. That one's an interesting one, in that in order to figure out what ability a card should have, what the uniqueness of a card. They're kind of not testing it in the whole meta. It seems they're testing it in their own seasons and seeing how they function. I do think that's a little weird, but I don't have too much to talk about there. It's like, maybe you should have more, you should have all the seasons together, but maybe that just gets hectic to figure out like the balance and stuff like that. But yeah, it's interesting. And then our internal meta game diverging from live. That's hilarious. That's what's funny. Like, we think this meta should look like this, and you guys are not doing that. Like, so who's wrong? Obviously, it's the internal meta game, right? Like the live servers are generally going to be usually what's more accurate, right? Just because there's more people playing, and there's usually better people playing as well, right? So, that is generally the truth. There is some consideration in that, like there are some outside influences, streamers and whatnot, content creators like influencing the meta in their own ways, but still, even with that, like it's still going to be generally accurate. These aren't excuses. We just want to know that we're investigating our process and taking steps to improve. Some of the changes we've made is design starts 4 weeks earlier. Season cards pass received double their previous playtesting. That's great. Playtesting methodologies are keeping seasons more mixed. So they're intentionally doing something to change that. So that's always good to see. And then they're also investing in more personnel and resource for balance work. So they're adding more people into the balancing team. So a lot of that is good. Obviously, it's nice for them to realize that they had issues, and it's also nice for them to take steps to addressing it. So I don't really have an issue with their change, and it's good. I do love it when they're being commutative, right? That's always a good idea. Well, not always, but like generally it's a good idea to incorporate goodwill by, explaining some of the issues that you're going. We're going to miss high and low. We're going to have bad ideas that look good for the first 100 hours. Our balance goals remain keeping the game fun, make the game fresh, and the cards you acquire enjoyable additions to your collection. So yeah, good overall thoughts. Kind of a response to the Mobius change, right? Like everyone, at least when this change was revealed, I do feel like it was pretty quickly, apparent that this was not the right direction, and there was a lot of faith lost in their balancing team. There's a lot of faith lost in some of the future going forward, especially with some of their terminology and words they were using. So they have to kind of say something like this to kind of address and restore some of it. Now, they want to talk about patches and OTA. We talked about this in other avenues, but because it's important to a topic, let's review our live balance methodology. So the design team updates the game in 2 ways: schedule patch changes, which happen every 4 weeks, and through OTA changes over the air, which happen every 2 weeks on Thursday. They probably look and feel similar, but they're very different. So most obvious is their content, right? OTA is usually just about the metagame, usually just adjusting, making sure it's more balanced, and just adjusting the cards cost and the skill, the ability, right? So it's not something where you're adding new game modes in the OTA, right? Like that's not going to happen. You're not going to add features. You're not going to add anything for players to data mine, right? Like data mined stuff only happens through the OTA, only happens through patches, not through the OTA. The patches are a different kind of update, right? If you want to change your card more dramatically, it requires a patch. So take the patch you released last time. That involves changes and features. It needs more time between locking and releasing them, right? So usually what happens, essentially what they're saying is their patches are locked very early during the month. So the 12/31 patch was final before 10/12. Whoa, like so basically the 3-4 weeks the patch is locked before they ship it out, and that's a big change, right? To have to kind of lock a patch 3-4 weeks in advance and then like see how the meta progresses, knowing that you have this patch that's going to just maybe not be accurate, right? Patch changes are in a difficult position. When we feel a big change may be warranted, we know the game could look very different by the time it's actually live. So for that reason, we're often careful in making big nerfs with patches, right? So this is just kind of an issue. I feel it's an issue with their patch timing, where they can't lock a patch in early and or late enough where their changes might be very relevant, or their changes might be accurate to the metagame as a whole. So it's just a difficulty since they have to lock it in so early. At least the way they develop right now, they have to lock it in so early that any large changes could just miss, right? I'm pretty sure almost all of the misses with patches, or the misses with like balance changes, happen because of a patch, right? They see it, they see an issue early, they lock it in, and then the metagame stabilizes, the metagame adjusts, and then once the patch rolls around, those changes stop making a lot of sense. I think that's pretty much just a general thing. Now, what to do about that, right? Like, if they don't want to change the design philosophy, does that mean they just stop making changes through, like, big meta changes through patches? I feel like that's not the healthiest approach, right? Usually what they've been doing is just like being careful with a patch, not really adjusting the meta. I would say they usually just adjust the subset of a meta, not really like what's causing meta issues or meta standards. And I don't know if that's something they want to go back to, but it is interesting that they have this kind of like flaw, in my opinion, just built into their patch timing window. So I do wonder how that's going to develop with time. And then finally, they're talking about Mobius, right? So the 31 October 31 patch did include a nerf. It changed Mobius, kind of destroyed Mobius, right? We knew patches risk being obsolete. Why make such a huge change? Well, data, right? It's always data, right? It's that, because that is, unfortunately a god, right? It's a god metric. Like, hey, if you want to make an easy change to convince other developers, just look at the data, showcase the data, right? So Mobius had an impact in the metagame, and what really scared them, it seems, was how it impacted Series 2 and Series 3 cards, especially players that are in Series 2 moving to Series 3, because that's a big chunk of like new player experience. And the new player experience is one of the most important experiences in the game. Like, if you don't like the new player experience, then it doesn't really matter like the rest, right? Because they're gonna leave, right? So it seems like that was what's going on. It was affecting the new player experience, and that made them like, okay, we gotta fix this, right? So many exciting strategies players got access to there basically disappeared overnight. So it's funny, it's not even the high level meta game that was scaring them. It wasn't really like, hey, your experience, hey, Loki at the top, da 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 da, is gone, or whatever. Like, all of that was really not the most important metric. It was like people, moving from Series 3 to Series 2, Series 3, probably were spending less time playing, probably just didn't have like a lot of fun strategies to work with, and that just felt bad for them, which makes sense. I think that's a very like fair justification to be scared, right? And usually with the patches, they only have a few days to react to discovery, as Mobius launched on 9/26. Now, you could say, why launch Mobius right before you have to lock in a patch, since it's one of the more problematic cards you're releasing, right? Don't you want to give yourself more time to kind of deal with a sudden shift in the meta? So that could be a fair point you could argue, right? Like, shouldn't you put some of your more problematic cards earlier on in a cycle so they have more time to look at the data before you have to lock in the patch, right? Like, that's super fair. Like, but that's not what they did. So they only had a few days to react, and bam, it wasn't good news for them, right? So they had to make a quick call or on what to do, and then they changed their numbers to there. So at the time, they worried they grossly misunderstood its long-term impact. So they were just scared that they didn't want it to be like Mobius in the game, permanent addition to all the decks, and now you can't really play any cost reducing cards. There was like a meme that Jeff made earlier today, I believe, where he was just like, look at the highest performing cards in Mobius meta, and it still all had cost reducing cards. Cost reducing cards still saw play in the highest. I do think that's because Mobius kind of toned down near the end of the cycle. People were playing it less. That's because people were not playing cost reducing cards. So because people were not playing cost reducing cards, the Mobius didn't do anything. So it just made less sense to play it. So people were just like, hey, maybe we just don't play it. So, it's kind of like an easy way to, like a counterintuitive way. But since less people were playing it, you could then play more Sarahs and Zabus, and it still works. So yeah. In hindsight, that was the wrong call. Mobius and metrics cost down in the metagame stabilized, and play rates of many affected cards decks improved. While Mobius was still overperforming, it became clear an OTA would likely work out, but they've already launched the patch, or they've already locked in the patch. So just a general like kind of fun issue with the way they lock their patches, right? It's so early that the metas can change. So this is almost a video in itself, right? Oh man, but what can you do? So generally, they also want to address like, hey, the way we worded the Mobius change was not healthy, right? Like created a big fear where it's like we're eager to make adjustments down the road in order to welcome cost reducing some strategies, and we're also interested to hear your feedback on our approach here, using a new card as a tool to create a new play environment temporarily, right? And we talked about this last patch, right? This was not great wording. This was very concerning if that was like a strategy they were going to do, right? This was carelessly written, failed to convey our intent, which was that we needed to protect cost reduction strategies, and snap if returning Mobius was too much. So yeah, so they're just like, hey, we don't do this theoretically, right? We don't launch cards with a nerf planned, and we don't nerf cards based on bundles, right? Like, so I mean, I think that's, or like, I feel like that doesn't really need to be said, but what it is true is like they might release overpowered cards, so that could need a nerf, right? Not necessarily guaranteed to need a nerf, but could need a nerf, right? Like, because cards that tend to be overpowered versus underpowered perform better, right? So the metric dictates that, hey, we should lean this way over leading cards that just don't see play at all, right? Like you've seen like old Negasonic, old Snowguard, old Howard. Well, Howard's still the same, right? But they see like very little play, and that's not something they want. So, we will launch cards we think we might need to nerf. Okay, that is exactly what I'm saying, right? Because game balance and production, they want to be like slightly overpowered, right? Like that's where you want it, where it's like, ooh, I want to play this, but not like, if I don't play this, I can't win, right? Like that's kind of where the bet they wanted to do it. We'd rather do that than launch cards we believe need a buff, because the risk is worth ensuring the new card. Yeah, because it's better for the bottom line. Obviously, we all know, but in those cases, we always made an earnest and responsible effort to hit a mark we hope can land us. Yeah. So yeah, they're just saying what I'm saying, essentially, which is fair. Like, who's gonna disagree with that? But yeah, now we can go kind of talk about the patch itself. There's already a 20-minute video, kind of concerning, but yeah, let's get into the actual patch. Oh man, do I want to cut this into two? We'll figure it out. But first of all, let's look at this. So we have Mobius. So this is going back to its old ability. Essentially, it used to be your cost can't be increased, your opponent's costs can't be reduced. Now, in this kind of like middle ground, like this two week or week and a half period, we found a lot of like people talking about like what ability should it be. essentially, right? Obviously, its on reveal ability is just like not useful at all, in my opinion. It's like what it doesn't do anything. So, they in that old ability it killed the card, but this one, right? This one is a little bit more powerful, a little bit more effective. Now the question is, it's now a 3-cost card instead of a 2-cost card. 2 costs you could pretty much put it in every deck, and it made there was like some room for it. 3 costs you have to be a little bit more deliberate with the decks that you can play this in, right? Because 3 costs is where decks start to like come online. It's where decks start to really showcase themselves, really tell you what they're playing. And a lot of times you don't necessarily want to play a card that doesn't fit into your deck identity in there. However, there's still some decks that you could definitely squeeze this in and it's not be too bad. Also think like, 3 costs is where a lot of good tech cards are at. And maybe that's just a general vibe they want to do, where a lot of the good tech cards are 3 or sometimes 4, right? Like with Shang-Chi and Enchantress and all that stuff. But Killmonger, Cosmo, Rogue sometimes, right? There's a lot of like good tech at 3, so adding Mobius doesn't hurt. I do wonder like how much Mobius is going to come back into the meta. Like that's my wonder. I mean it's always going to be a reaction to what the meta looks like, right? If a lot of meta people are playing Sarah again or Zabu again, maybe. Even though Zabu is like not too bad, right? Because if you play Zabu on 2, you at least get to play your 4-drop on 3, so you at least get some power. Same thing with Ravonna, at least get a turn to utilize it. So even then, it doesn't feel like horrible. So it's better. It's now playable. Now the question is like, what decks do you put this in where it doesn't hurt you? Is the difficulty in line? So like overall, like this is a better change, right? Like I mean, but like that's so easy. That's such a low bar. The question is like, does this mean this card is going to be played again? Does this mean this card is going to kind of influence the meta in such a large way? I'm not sure. Like I do think it being a 3/3 is a lot. It hurts its playability, actually, right? Like 2 costs you can play in everything. Like that's why Jeff is great. If Jeff was like a 3/4, it wouldn't be played in everything. Right? But 2 costs you can kind of just put in everything. So I do wonder, like, it's probably the right approach, right? To make it not overbearing. Because if you put it back to a 2/3, it's just gonna be in everything. So definitely healthier. Right, I just wonder like what decks are you gonna play? Then is this still gonna be in everything? Probably not, but at least gives you the chance to play with a card again. So overall, that's better. I'm mostly indifferent. Like I'm mostly not sure in terms of like what the meta looks like. Do you still see a lot of this? But even then, even in like the Mobius meta, a lot of people are still just getting away with cost reduction decks. Like it still was fine because you're not always going to see Mobius, and when it comes out, now it's going to be very like you're going to be able to do something with your cost reduction in a lot of cases, right? Unless you're playing Sarah or something, or I guess Mr. Negative. But if you're playing Mr. Negative, you already know your life. So other than that, like I feel a lot of the early game cost reductions, you're kind of already going to get some value, and that's going to be enough. So I could definitely see this like having a significantly lower play rate. So interesting. I'm done talking about not patch changes, so we're gonna skip this. Next up, this one is pretty interesting. This is something I've considered. I've always wondered why Doctor Strange wasn't a 2/3. 3/3 was just so expensive, and I think 2/3 you can definitely justify playing the card, especially in move or anything. Even in like tech decks, you could kind of just use that to mess with people. So I'm generally fine with this. I do think move decks are getting a lot of love over time, right? Which, to be fair, they needed. So I'm not even sad about that. But yeah, even you can play this maybe in non-move decks now. I think 3/3 was just so expensive; it was just hard to really justify. You can also say that there's definitely been some power creep, right? Like that. You can do this and it doesn't feel broken. I remember when I first thought about this change, I was like, nah, it's too good. Now I see it, I'm like, yeah, it's probably fine. So that's probably just a notion of like how much stronger your average deck has gotten. But I think that makes sense as you add new combos, right? People aren't making their decks weaker over time, right? Like that's just like as you add new cards, their decks are not getting weaker; they're just getting stronger, and then some cards have to kind of adjust to deal with the stronger meta game. And I definitely think Doctor Strange is one of those cards. Like sometimes you play it earlier on as a new player, but once you kind of fight the stronger decks, it's like this card is too slow. And it's sad because even in move decks you wouldn't play this, right? Like this is where it's supposed to have its best chance, but even in those decks it kind of struggled. So this makes sense to me. I do kind of wonder what it's gonna look like though. Many of us fondly remember our first move decks. No, I remember losing with them and saying this is not for me. But as collections matured, this enjoyable card often fell to the wayside in an effort to augment its long-term potential while keeping a fun early-stage card. We're trying a simple change. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think it's fine to try. I still keep my eye on it and see how the balance looks like. But yeah, I think it's fine to try it. Next up, we have Shang-Chi. This is a big change. This is a I didn't change the stats. It's a 4/3 to a 4/3. It's not a 3/3 to a 3/5. But essentially, Shang-Chi is going from destroying 9 power cards to destroying 10 power cards. This is a pretty big change. It is a big change. However, they did do some adjustments to kind of incorporate this, so it's not going to feel as negative. However, it does. I think it gives second inner more room to play with, right? Like, because I think that was their issue where Shang-Chi kind of locks so many design decisions, especially for like 5 and 6 cost cards. You always have to think about, hey, am I making this card weaker by making it 9 power instead of 8 power? And it sucks because a lot of like 9 and 8 and 9 power is something 4 drops can do in a lot of cases, right? So you kind of you make 4 drops like the ceiling of power, and then 5 drops have this Shang-Chi risk, right? In a lot of cases, and that's just like not. It makes it hard to focus on 5 and 6 drops when you have this like easy. Hey, if they have this card and a lot of people are running it, I lose. So just upping the power by 1 just gives you a lot more room to work with in terms of 5 drops specifically, where you can put things as 9 power and not have to worry about like, oh, this is going to get killed here. So I think this is probably a healthy change in for long term for the game and long term for second dinner's design options, right? Which right now, they were kind of hitting a wall in terms of like how much design they can do. So overall, I'm fine with a Shang-Chi nerf. Shang-Chi has been the most popular card for pretty much since the game started. It's been one of the most popular cards. It's definitely lowered down a little bit with more tools, right, to deal with big cards, but it still has a large enough presence that it's still something to look into. So we've been waiting for the right time to deploy this change. Since we began considering and vetting it, the conversation about Shang-Chi and ubiquity and decks have both changed dramatically. I would say, yeah, I would say there's definitely less Shang-Chi now than there was 2-3 months ago. I think that was probably where it was like in almost every other deck. Now you can kind of get away with not playing Shang-Chi, even though it's still like probably the most popular card. Like that or Chavez, right? Or the 2 most popular cards, but it's still like that's still a concern. We first began considering this adjustment because it was simply so popular, which I agree with. Some people might disagree with this, but I think a card being very popular is enough to nerf it. That's all it takes. Like I will say season pass cards, newly released cards, those those are fine to be popular without being changed. Like, yes, play with the new card. But if a card has been in the game for like 4 months and it's the most popular card in the game by far, like that's probably enough for me to just adjust it. So I'm okay with that. And a lot of people disagree with that notion, but I do. I don't. I think if you're just popular, like by far, you're the best 4-dropper or whatever. That's enough for me. So, a player that would merit a nerf in most cards, even though his other performance metrics were average. However, two good other reasons emerged as we first started over. I mean, I don't think his metrics are average. Like his play to cube rate was probably pretty large because you can play him on the last turn to dominate. So, first of all, 10 is just a better number than 5. I mean, in game designer speak, sure, it's easier to remember. It's an intuitive benchmark and has a special significance due to this time. That's fair. I mean, I don't care too much, but it's fair. And as a game designer, it's a lot easier to balance around 10 than 9. That's true. We'll be using this threshold for more cards in the future. Secondly, this card adds space. Yeah, this is what I was more concerned about. It gives them better room to design 5 or 6 cost cards. Yeah, I agree with this for sure. We're also making related changes to other cards so that Shang-Chi still destroy some existing cards that he could use a buff, while others he wasn't destroying have room to grow power now. And the other cards we aren't changing that Shang-Chi will no longer destroy includes Black Cat, Rescue, Abomination, Living Tribunal, and the occasional Ronin or Devil Dinosaurs. Yeah, those are fair. That's a good point. So essentially these cards are getting buffed, right? Black Cat, Rescue, which I think are fair. Abomination is fair. Living Tribunal, whatever. Ronin, Devil Dinosaur, I guess if they get too big, you kill them. So that's a fair counterplay. We'll be monitoring all these cards closely to make sure their performance repaints are appropriate. Looking at you, Living Tribunal. Yeah, Living Tribunal and Devil Dinosaur would be the two concerns for me, but I'm fine to let it play out, right? We're optimistic. So yeah, definitely, I think one of the biggest changes. A lot of cards get to survive. Cards like Rescue, no one could really play because it just gets Shang-Chi'd, right? And the issue with Rescue in particular is that you had to play Rescue early, right? Since you needed a turn to get its power off. Now you can just play it and not have to worry about it. So I definitely think that's pretty solid. So we'll have to see. Then again, and then I think if you're playing Ronin for 9 power, you're losing, right? I'm just gonna throw that in there. Anyways, let's continue. So they do have some adjustments, right? First off is Monster from Monster Island. You're just keeping the generic token in Monster Island Shang-Chi. I think that's perfectly fine. Next up, we have She-Hulk. So She-Hulk is also getting buffed up to a 610. It used to be a 610, got nerfed to a 6'9", now back to a 610. I think this is fine. She-Hulk was just a nice card that definitely could use some buffs in the metagame, especially with Mobius, but with Mobius being a little bit less played, I would say, with this change. So I think you can definitely get away with She-Hulk being a 610. And generally it's fine. Especially with more cards getting buffed, you can see the power creep, right? Like some cards are just going to be stronger for not no reason, but for justifiable reasons. But it still makes every other card a little bit worse, right? So this I'm okay with. She-Hulk's a fun card that merited a nerf earlier in the year. True, yeah. So I do think at the time of a nerf, she was definitely too strong. So she was nerfed pretty quickly after she was, not quickly, but generally after she was released, just because she was just the best. She was honestly the best card in the game at the time, with her power level and her ubiquitous and the fact you could combo her with Wave and Death, right? You could combo her with Wave and Death. You can't do any of that now, so it's definitely not as necessary to have her be so lower powered compared to what she used to be. Given one of the more popular things to do with She-Hulk is to make copies of her. Yeah, if you copy her, they both get discounted. You can play both of them. It's important to Shades and Shang-Chi range as so that he functions as a counter to that strategy. And then Hulk sitting at less than 10 power doesn't feel right. Sure, like I don't know about that. Next up, we have Warpath. So Warpath is getting a buff. I guess it is, right? Fundamentally, it's a buff, right? You go from 649 to a 410, right? You still get Shang-Chiable, but I think that's okay. So generally, Warpath is a card that doesn't really see play, so I'm fine with it getting a buff. So this is generally fine, not a big deal. Okay to me. It's a pretty efficient powerhouse in early meta games. So yeah, so this is like a series 2 meta card. And that makes him the kind of card we like Shang to be able to handle. However, given he's not popular in competitive play, he's a fine candidate for a buff. And it finds a cool moment. So they like it when you move your Nightcrawler to Warpath on the final turn to dodge the Shang-Chi. They like that, you know. And I guess that's fair. That's fair. I can't hate on them for saying that. So generally a fine change here. Next up, we have Jessica Jones. This used to be one of my favorite cards, I guess, when I was starting. Right? Obviously, it fell off, right? But you know, back when you start, like it's just so consistent, good power, just solid card. They've turned her from a 4/4 to a 4/5, so now she's a 4/9. That's actually quite decent, I think, as a 4-drop. So I could definitely see more people, you know, playing her, incorporating her. She's still a great card after Storm, and probably will continue to be a great card after Storm. So seems like a good buff, right? You don't really play this card. Don't really play this card in the competitive scene right now, so I think a buff is generally fine. Jessica Jones is kind of the converse of Warpath as an early 4-cost, offering bonus power for a fairly small drawback, but while avoiding Shang-Chi's effect. That will remain true, but made this buff will help her find the occasional home in a larger meta game. Yeah, so this is fine to me. The larger metagame right now is just after Storm, but I still think like as a 4/9 is just like that's a good stat line. 4/9 is a good stat line, so I think you maybe just play her as maybe a Zabu piece or something like that. Yeah, for sure. Next up, we have Strong Guy. So initially when I read this, I thought this wasn't a buff, but I didn't realize that. I thought it was turning into a 4/3, but it's a 3/3, which is significantly different, right? Like 3/3 is not the best, but obviously you have the ongoing to turn into a 3/9, which is really good. So there is definitely potential for this to see play now. So I'm definitely interested. The easiest way to do it is play it after MODOK, right? Like, so you play MODOK on 5, you get a 3/9, and then you can play your Apocalypse or you can play your Chavez on the final turn. The one caveat is that means you can't play Swarms. Well, no, you can play Swarms, so generally it's fine, right? And if you're playing Dracula as well, right, you can still get away with fun stuff. So I do think that makes it better. Like a 3/9 is not bad. It's not bad to play on turn 3. So this card might have some new tools to work with. So, you know, definitely an interesting adjustment. I do think Strong Guy was the least popular card in the game. Like that's true, right? So maybe it definitely gets a more play rate, and I do think like it's somewhat hard to, unless you're playing discard, it's hard to discard your hand. Like the only other decks that really can make that work is like Zoo Kazoo. Those are like the two main options, I would say. And even in Kazoo, that means you have to be very, very specific in like what you're drafting. Means you're not running like a 6/6 or 5/5 drops or anything like that. So that could work for sure. And there are some zoo benefit cards coming up in the game. So there's definitely some consideration for this in the future. But yeah, definitely interesting for discard. I think is the easiest way to really just make this work. So we'll have to see. Definitely some people are going to try it out now and see how it feels. But this is a double adjustment as we're moving Strong Guy out of Shang-Chi range. True, right. That was another issue. You just buff him and he gets Shang-Chi. And then we're buffing him to better complement his supporting cast, giving how many strong 4 cards discard decks have available. So they're saying this, in their eyes, this is mostly a discard card. And since this card already has a ton of strong 4s, they're moving him to 3 to kind of make him fit better in the curve. Now you can play him before Hell Cow and threaten a lot of power very quickly. No, you're playing him before MODOK. Like, I mean, I guess you can play him before Hell Cow, but I don't know if Hell Cow is gonna discard your whole hand like that. But maybe it will. Strong Guy's also unique as a discard reward that doesn't want you to play Apocalypse. Right. Right, that's true, right? Because Apocalypse won't work with Strong Guy. So you'd have to justify, do you want to be playing Strong Guy deck or Apocalypse deck? Weird. That is true. Well, you could still just play Apocalypse final turn. Like if you're playing what's it called? If you're playing Dracula, sorry, why did that take so long? If you're playing Dracula, you just play Apocalypse and you discard the American Chavez. And that still works. You lose 4 power, but you gain 6. So you gain +2 power. And it also might trick them, but then again, it won't trick them if you get used to this deck build. So maybe early on it tricks them, but later on people know what you're doing. So interesting. Overall, it's interesting, right? This is definitely a new change that makes some sense. So I'm down to see what goes on after that. And then finally, we have, last but not least, they're making some OTA changes. So they're not gonna have OTA on 11/23 and January the 4th. So they're just gonna be on holiday basically. So that's fine. I mean, unless you're mad about that, but that's generally fine. So quite okay. But overall, right, once we look into all the changes again, Strong Guy I'm fine with, right? Strong Guy's been weak. Jessica Jones I like. Warpath I think is fair. Seahawk is fair. Monster, obviously you have to do that. Shang-Chi, I'm okay with Shang-Chi change. Once again, right? Most popular card and hard to balance around or design around other cards, with Shang-Chi kind of making them all feel kind of the same vulnerability. Doctor Strange, I'm fine to test with. I would still keep my eye on it and see how good it is, but fine to test this for sure. And Mobius change, I mean, you know, it's better than before, right? Like that's the truth. It's better than before. I just wonder what decks can play with it, and maybe that's the change they want, right? Where you really have to think about what decks really can play with this, maybe Sarah Control and things like that. But other than that, like, I don't think you're gonna see super high Mobius presence again with this change. So we'll have to see. But yeah, overall, another long patch, not necessarily due to the patch itself, even though there are a lot of changes, but due to kind of the first 4 pages where they kind of talk about their balancing and whatnot. So yeah, definitely an interesting one. Makes sense to me. Overall, a lot of good changes, so we'll just have to see for the future. But yeah, that's what we got for today. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.
Educated calling snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to marvel snap. Your skills will be